Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Sanhedrin. We are up to Perek Yud Aleph Mishnah Bet. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'elui Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana Ranbayev, Eliyahu ben Burchai Israelov, Chana ben Miriam, Sason ben Ryan, Yoshu ben Shifra, Menuchatam began Eden, Amen, Elabdi ben Chaim Lechaim, V'derefua Shelemav Daniel Shalom ben Rosa, B'tor Shah Cholei Yisrael, Nadachlama Mera, Binyamin, Otzion Chai ben Dvorah. This Mishnah discusses the third sin that was listed in yesterday's Mishnah. Zaken mamre al pi bedin. A sage who rebels against the high court is put to death. Shenemar ki pale mimcha davar lemishpat v'gomer. As it is stated in the book of Dvarim, chapter 17, verses 8 through 12, if a matter of judgment is hidden from you, etc., you shall rise and go up to the place that God will choose. You shall come to the Kohanim, the Leviim, and to the judge who will be in those days. You shall ask, and they will tell you the word of judgment. You shall act according to the word that they will tell you from that place that God will choose. The man who acts with willfulness, not listening to the Kohen or the judge, that man shall die. This passage is about a sage who disagrees with the ruling of a court in his town. The Torah requires him and the judges of the court to go up to the place that God will choose, referring to the temple in Jerusalem, and present their opinions to the high court there, who will then decide which side is right. The Mishnah describes the procedure that should be followed. Shelosha bate dinina yusham. There were 3 courts there in Jerusalem. Echad yoshev al petach harabayit. One would sit at the entrance to the Temple Mount. This court actually sat just outside the gate of the women's courtyard, which was well within the wall of the Temple Mount. This gate was called the entrance to the Temple Mount because people used it on the way out of the temple when going from the women's courtyard to the Temple Mount, as the diagram is brought down in the art school stated in the note. And this court was a lower Sanhedrin of 23 judges, as the Gemara says on page 88b in Masechet Sanhedrin. Ve'echad yoshev al petach hazara. One would sit at the entrance to the temple courtyard. This court was located just outside the gate that led from the women's courtyard into the main courtyard. It too was a lower Sanhedrin of 23 judges. Ve'echad yoshev b'lishkat hagazit. And one would sit in the chamber of hewn stone, which was partly in the courtyard itself. The chamber was built into the wall of the courtyard, with half the chamber in the courtyard and half outside the courtyard. This was the great Sanhedrin of 71 judges. Ba'im lazeh she'al petach harabayit. When a sage and his local court disagree, they first come to the court at the entrance to the Temple Mount. This is the first court they encounter as they enter the temple area. Ve'omer kach darashti v'chach darshu chaverai. And the sage says, this is what I taught the public, and this is what my colleagues taught the public. Kach lamati v'kach limdu chaverai. Or this is what I taught my students, and this is what my colleagues taught their students. Im shamu omrim lahem. If the judges at the entrance to the Temple Mount had heard the relevant law from their teachers, meaning they had received the law from authorities of earlier generations, they tell it to them. V'im lav ba'in lahem le'otan shel petach hazara. But if they had not heard the law, the sage and the judges of his local court come to those judges who sit at the entrance of the courtyard. Ve'omer kach darashti v'kach darshu chaverai. And the sage says, this is what I taught the public, and this is what my colleagues taught the public. Or this is what I taught my students, and this is what my colleagues taught their students. If the judges at the entrance to the courtyard had heard the relevant law from their teachers, they tell it to them. But if not, the sage and the judges of his local court and the judges of the first 2 courts come to the high court that is in the chamber of hewn stone. When they go to the high court, which has 71 members and whose decision must be accepted by everyone, the judges from the first 2 courts go with them to hear how the high court will rule. At the previous stage, however, when the sage and the judges of his local court went to the second court in Jerusalem, which sat at the entrance of the courtyard, the judges of the first court, which sat at the entrance to the Temple Mount, did not join them. Since the second court also had 23 judges, the first court is not bound by the ruling of the second court. Shemimenu yotzeh Torah lechol Yisrael, the reason that the two courts and the sage and the judges of his local court go to the high court that is in the Lishkat HaGazit is because the Mishnah says Shemimenu yotzeh Torah lechol Yisrael, from which Torah goes out to the entire Jewish people. Shneimar mina makom hahu asher yivchar Adonai. As it is stated in the book of Dvarim, chapter 17, verse 10, you shall act according to the word that they will tell you from that place that God will choose, the Lishkat HaGazit, which is part of the temple where God chooses to dwell. Once the high court rules on the matter, meaning if the judges of the high court had not heard the law from their teachers, they use the standard methods of deriving laws from the Torah, or they use their own logic. The first two courts, however, may not decide between the two sides unless they have heard the law from earlier authorities. But once the high court rules on the matter, their decision must be accepted by everyone. The Mishnah teaches what happens if the sage refuses to accept the high court's ruling. If he returns to his town and learns and teaches as he did before, meaning he does not change his opinion, even though the high court had ruled against him, but he does not tell anyone to follow his opinion, he is not liable to a death penalty. However, if he did instruct someone to act according to his opinion, or if he acted that way himself, as the Gemara explains on page 88b in Sanhedrin, Chayav, he is liable to a death penalty. As it is stated there in verse 12, the man who acts with willfulness, that man shall die. And no chayavat sheyoel ha'asot, by stating acts with willfulness, the verse teaches that he is not liable unless he instructs someone to act. Another law about a sage who rebels, talmid shora la'asot patur. If a student who is not qualified to be a judge goes through the procedure described in the Mishnah and rejects the ruling of the high court and instructed someone to act according to his own opinion, he is not liable to a death penalty. It is derived from the Torah that the law of the rebellious sage, Zaken Mamre, applies only to a qualified judge. The reason is that if he is not qualified, the people whom he instructed should have known not to listen to him. Only a qualified judge is put to death for this sin. Nimtza chumro kulo. It emerges that the added seriousness of his sin in that he not only disobeyed the high court, but also gave a ruling when he was not qualified to do so, is a leniency for him, because his lack of qualification exempts him from the death penalty. And that is then of Mishnah Bet. Mishnah Gimel teaches that a sage who rebels against the high court is not liable to execution unless the law he rejects is of a certain type. Chomer b'divrei sofrim b'divrei Torah. There is something stricter about biblical laws that are explained by the words of the sages than biblical laws that are written clearly in the words of the Torah. Biblical laws that are explained by the words of the sages refers to a biblical law that is not written explicitly in the Torah, but is learned from the Torah through an interpretation of this that the sages received from authorities of earlier generations. What's the stringency? Ha'omer en tefillin kedei la'avor al divrei Torah. For example, if a sage says there is no obligation to wear tefillin because he wants to transgress the words of the Torah, which state clearly that there is such an obligation, meaning he agrees that the Torah obligates the wearing of tefillin, but he tells people not to fulfill this obligation. However, if he says that wearing tefillin is unnecessary because he does not believe in the truth of the Torah, he is a heretic and not a sage who rebels. But again, back to the example of the Mishnah, he agrees that the Torah obligates the wearing of tefillin, but he tells people not to fulfill the obligation. Patur, he is not liable to a death penalty. Since the obligation of wearing tefillin is writtenly open in the Torah, it is obvious to everyone that the sage's ruling is mistaken. This is not considered a ruling at all, and he is not put to death for it. Chamesh totafot leosif al divrei sofrim. However, if he says there should be 5 compartments in the tefillin of the head, which adds to the words of the sages who taught that the number of compartments is 4, the head tefillin contain 4 compartments, each of which contains a scroll on which a different biblical passage is written. The sages learned the number of compartments from the spelling of certain words in the Torah. If he says there should be a 5th compartment, chayav, he is liable to the death penalty because this law is not written explicitly in the Torah and would not be known were it not for the explanation given by the sages. And that is the Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.